The hardest thing to give is often the very last thing you have. Grace Bennet had not eaten in almost 2 days. Yet she still paused every time the warm scent of fresh bread drifted through the streets of Frost Hollow Pack. Hunger no longer felt like sharp pain. It had become a quiet companion, a dull ache that followed every step and reminded her how quickly life could change. Just 1 week earlier she had worked long hours at a family-owned bakery, rising before sunrise to knead dough and sweep flour from worn wooden floors. Then business slowed, customers stopped coming, and the owner quietly apologized before handing her the final paycheck he could afford. Since then, every dollar had disappeared into rent, firewood, and the simplest necessities. On this chilly autumn afternoon, only 3 crumpled dollar bills remained in her pocket. They were enough for exactly 1 bowl of vegetable soup from the small stand near the town square. Grace wrapped both hands around the steaming bowl as though it were precious treasure. The warmth spread slowly through her cold fingers, making her realize just how exhausted she truly was. Her stomach tightened at the rich aroma of herbs and vegetables. 1 spoonful would have eased the dizziness that had followed her all morning. She quietly thanked the elderly vendor, smiled with genuine gratitude, and began walking toward the small park where she often ate alone beneath the old maple trees. The afternoon breeze carried golden leaves across the stone pathways, and families wandered happily through the square with baskets full of fresh produce and warm pastries. Children laughed while chasing one another between market stalls decorated for the harvest season. Grace watched them with gentle eyes, never allowing herself to envy their happiness. She believed everyone carried burdens hidden beneath ordinary smiles. As she reached the edge of the park, her footsteps slowed. Sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench was an elderly woman wrapped in a faded gray shawl. Her silver hair escaped beneath the worn fabric, and her thin hands trembled slightly against the cold air. She was not asking anyone for help. She simply watched. People passed with quiet dignity while dozens walked by without slowing down. Then Grace noticed the woman's eyes linger for only a brief second on the bowl of soup before looking away as though embarrassed by her own hunger. Something inside Grace's chest tightened. She recognized that look immediately because she had seen it in her own reflection many mornings before. It was the silent expression of someone trying to hide an empty stomach behind quiet pride. Grace lowered her eyes to the soup. A cloud of steam still drifted gently upward. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the bowl. Every sensible thought urged her to keep walking. Tomorrow she could search for work again if she had enough strength. Without food, even climbing the hills outside town would become difficult. She closed her eyes for only a moment before taking a slow breath. Then she turned around. Walking toward the elderly woman, Grace offered the bowl with both hands and smiled, as though she were giving away something ordinary instead of the only meal she had. "Please," she said softly. "You need this more than I do." The woman looked up in complete surprise. "Child," she whispered, "what will you eat?" Grace's smile remained gentle despite the hunger twisting quietly inside her stomach. "I still have hope," she answered. "Sometimes hope keeps people standing longer than food." Tears shimmered briefly in the elderly woman's pale blue eyes as she carefully accepted the warm bowl. Grace simply nodded, tucked her empty hands into the pockets of her worn coat, and continued walking beneath the falling autumn leaves without looking back. She never noticed the graceful black carriage waiting beyond the far end of the park, hidden beneath towering oak trees. She never saw the cloaked guard standing silently in the shadows. And she never imagined that the woman now holding her only meal was not a forgotten stranger at all, but the one person in the entire kingdom capable of changing her destiny forever. Grace Bennet disappeared beyond the rows of maple trees with an empty stomach but a peaceful heart, believing the afternoon would end like every other difficult day. Behind her, the elderly woman remained seated on the weathered bench, cradling the warm bowl of soup with both hands as gentle steam drifted into the cool autumn air. For several quiet moments she did not lift the spoon. Instead, she watched the young Omega slowly disappear into the crowded streets until the last glimpse of the faded blue coat vanished beyond the marketplace. Then the silence changed. From beneath the towering oak trees surrounding the park, several figures dressed in dark traveling cloaks stepped forward with measured precision. They moved quietly enough that nearby families continued enjoying the afternoon without noticing anything unusual. One after another, they lowered their heads with absolute respect before the elderly woman. The oldest among them spoke first. "Your Majesty, the carriage is ready." The woman gently placed the untouched bowl on the bench beside her before removing the faded gray shawl that had hidden her appearance throughout the day. Her silver hair settled neatly across her shoulders, and the weariness that had softened her posture disappeared, replaced by quiet dignity earned through decades of leadership. She was Eleanor Ashford, Queen Mother of the Northern Kingdom, widow of the late Alpha King and the one person whose wisdom still guided the royal family through every difficult decision. The captain of her shadow guard looked toward the direction Grace had walked. "Should we bring the young woman to the palace?" Eleanor answered without hesitation. "No." Her voice remained calm, warm and certain. If kindness only appears after a reward is offered, then it was never kindness. She finally lifted the bowl of soup and tasted the first spoonful. It had already begun to cool, yet a faint smile touched her lips. "Simple," she whispered almost to herself, "but given with everything she had." The captain remained silent, understanding the deeper meaning behind those words. Eleanor had spent nearly a month traveling through villages disguised as an ordinary stranger. She had shared benches with merchants, laborers, nobles, and travelers. Many had shown politeness. A few had offered spare coins. Some had pretended she did not exist. None had given away their last meal. She looked once more toward the bustling town square where Grace had disappeared into the crowd. "Find out everything about Grace Bennet," Eleanor instructed. "Where she lives, where she works, who her family is, and what burdens she carries." The captain bowed immediately. "Yes, Your Majesty." Another guard stepped forward carefully. "If she discovers who you are." Eleanor shook her head gently. "She must not." Her pale blue eyes reflected the golden leaves dancing across the park. The truest measure of a heart is what it chooses when no one important seems to be watching. She stood gracefully as a magnificent black carriage rolled quietly from behind the trees. The royal crest remained covered beneath dark fabric so passing villagers would see nothing more than another wealthy traveler leaving town. Before entering the carriage, Eleanor looked down at the nearly empty bowl once more. "Do not return this," she said softly. "Keep it." The captain looked surprised. "Your Majesty?" Eleanor smiled with quiet affection. "One day my son may ask how I recognize the woman worthy of standing beside an Alpha King." She gently traced one finger along the rim of the bowl. "When that day comes, I want him to understand that kingdoms are not strengthened by wealth alone. Sometimes they are changed forever by a single meal shared between two strangers." As the carriage disappeared along the winding road beneath the amber glow of the late afternoon sun, Grace continued searching for another chance to earn tomorrow's bread, never imagining that the greatest turning point of her life had already begun with a bowl of soup she would never taste. The next morning arrived with a thin layer of frost covering the rooftops of Frost Hollow Pack, painting the village in soft shades of silver beneath the rising sun. Grace Bennet pulled her worn coat tightly around her shoulders before stepping outside the tiny room she rented above an aging carpenter's workshop. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small stove that had long since run out of firewood. She paused for a moment as her stomach quietly reminded her that she had gone another night without supper. Taking a slow breath, she whispered to herself, "One more day." Then she smiled as though hope alone could warm the cold morning air. She spent the first several hours walking from one business to another, politely asking whether anyone needed extra help. The blacksmith apologized because he had already hired 2 apprentices. The tailor thanked her but explained business had been slow for months. Even the bakery where she had once worked could offer nothing beyond kind wishes for better days ahead. By noon, the $3 she had saved were gone, and so was every opportunity she had hoped to find. As Grace crossed the marketplace, 2 women standing outside a fabric shop recognized her immediately. One whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "There goes the girl who gave away her lunch." The other laughed softly. "If she keeps making decisions like that, she will be begging beside the road herself." Grace heard every word. She slowed only for a heartbeat before continuing forward with the same quiet expression. She had learned long ago that answering cruelty often gave it more strength. A few steps later, an elderly fruit merchant accidentally dropped a wooden crate filled with apples. Bright red fruit rolled across the cobblestone street while hurried shoppers stepped around them without stopping. Grace immediately knelt to gather every apple before they disappeared beneath passing carts. The grateful merchant reached into the crate and offered her the largest apple he could find. "Please," he said warmly. "You helped me when no one else did." Grace accepted it with both hands and thanked him sincerely. For a brief moment she simply looked at the apple, its deep crimson skin glowing beneath the afternoon sunlight. It would be the first thing she had eaten since the morning before yesterday. Her fingers tightened gently around it as another quiet wave of hunger passed through her. Just then, she noticed a small boy standing near the edge of the square. His patched jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, and his eyes remained fixed on the apple in her hands before quickly turning away in embarrassment. Grace recognized that look instantly. Without hesitation she walked toward him and crouched until they were at eye level. "Would you like to share this with me?" she asked softly. The boy looked startled. "Really?" Grace nodded. She borrowed a small knife from the fruit merchant, carefully sliced the apple into 2 equal pieces, and handed the larger half to the child. His face brightened with grateful surprise as he whispered, "Thank you." Grace smiled and took a small bite from her own piece. It was sweet, crisp, and somehow tasted even better because someone else was smiling beside her. Neither of them noticed a woman wearing the simple clothing of an ordinary flower seller arranging bouquets across the street. Hidden beneath a plain bonnet, Queen Mother Eleanor Ashford watched the entire scene without saying a single word. Beside her, disguised as another customer, the captain of the Shadow Guard quietly observed Grace sharing the only food she had received all day. Eleanor lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking so softly that only the captain could hear. Yesterday she gave away her last meal because she had compassion. Today she shares her first meal because compassion is simply who she is. 3 quiet days passed, and Grace Bennet never realized that every ordinary decision she made was becoming part of an invisible story unfolding around her. Each morning she left her tiny rented room before sunrise, searching for any honest work she could find, and each evening she returned with tired feet, empty pockets, and the same gentle smile that somehow refused to disappear. She believed life was testing her endurance. She never imagined someone else was quietly measuring her heart. Queen Mother Eleanor Ashford had delayed her return to the capital, choosing instead to remain inside Frost Hollow Pack under a different disguise each day. She no longer appeared as the hungry traveler from the park. One morning she became an elderly flower seller arranging faded bouquets outside the chapel. Another afternoon she wore the simple clothing of a widow purchasing bread in the market. On the following day she quietly sat near the town well pretending to rest after a long journey. Grace crossed paths with her every time without recognizing the familiar pale blue eyes, hidden beneath different hats and scarves. Late one afternoon, while delivering a stack of freshly mended blankets for a seamstress who had offered her temporary work, Grace noticed an older man struggling beside the narrow bridge leading into town. One wheel of his small wooden cart had slipped into a deep rut left by recent rain, leaving sacks of grain leaning dangerously to one side. Several healthy young alphas walked past without stopping, laughing together as they continued toward the tavern before sunset. Grace immediately placed the blanket safely beneath a nearby tree and hurried over. "Please hold the handles steady," she said gently. The old farmer nodded, breathing heavily as Grace knelt beside the wheel. Mud stained her sleeves and the hem of her faded blue dress, while she searched for loose stones strong enough to lift the sunken wheel. Working together, they slowly pushed until the cart finally rolled free with a heavy creak. The farmer wiped his forehead and smiled with enormous relief. "You have already done more for me than people half my age," he said gratefully. He reached into one of the grain sacks and removed a small cloth pouch. "Please accept this." Grace looked inside and saw several silver coins. She immediately shook her head. "Thank you, but I cannot take money for helping someone who simply needed another pair of hands." The farmer insisted, but Grace gently folded his fingers back around the pouch. "Buy yourself a warm dinner instead," she said with a quiet smile. "That will make me happier." Hidden beneath the wooden awning of a nearby candle shop, Eleanor watched every moment without interrupting. Beside her stood the captain of the Shadow Guard disguised as an ordinary merchant studying pottery displayed outside the neighboring store. "Your Majesty," he murmured softly. She refused payment again. Eleanor's eyes never left Grace as the young Omega gathered her blankets and continued across the bridge as though nothing remarkable had happened.
"No, Eleanor answered thoughtfully.
She refused to place a price on compassion. That evening, inside the modest room she had quietly rented above the village inn, Eleanor opened a small leather notebook that had accompanied her throughout the journey. Beneath Grace Bennett's name she carefully wrote another sentence. She helps because another person is struggling, not because another person is watching. Eleanor closed the notebook slowly before looking through the window toward the distant northern road disappearing beyond the hills. Somewhere beyond those mountains her son, Alpha King Lucas Ashford, was leading his escort home after months spent protecting the kingdom's borders. A peaceful smile touched her face as the last light of sunset faded across the valley. "You have spent years searching for a queen among noble houses," she whispered into the quiet room. "Soon you will meet the woman who has been living like one all along, even without a crown." The royal carriage crossed the great stone bridge leading into Ashford Palace just as the first rays of morning sunlight painted the towers with soft gold. Alpha King Lucas Ashford dismounted before the palace gates with the quiet confidence of a man more comfortable on distant roads than inside grand halls. Months spent traveling along the northern borders had left traces of wind and rain upon his black cloak, yet his posture remained straight, his silver eyes calm and observant. Servants and royal guards bowed respectfully as he entered the palace, but Lucas acknowledged them with only a gentle nod. There was only one person he wished to see before attending councils or ceremonies. Queen Mother Eleanor Ashford welcomed her son inside the sunlit royal library, where tall windows overlooked endless gardens glowing with autumn colors. She smiled warmly as Lucas embraced her, grateful that another long journey had ended safely. After they sat beside the fireplace, Eleanor poured fresh tea into 2 delicate cups before quietly studying her son's thoughtful face. "You seem disappointed," she observed softly. Lucas released a quiet breath. "Every village I visited asked the same question." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "When will the Alpha King choose his Luna?" Lucas looked into the dancing flames. For several silent moments, "They speak of noble daughters with perfect manners, influential families and impressive fortunes. Yet every introduction feels carefully rehearsed. Everyone wishes to meet the crown before they meet the man." Eleanor listened patiently without interrupting. She had heard similar words before. Lucas finally looked toward her. "Mother, I have met kindness offered for recognition, generosity displayed before audiences, smiles that disappeared the moment they believed no one important was watching. I no longer know whether genuine goodness still exists." Eleanor's expression softened. Slowly, she reached beside her chair and placed a familiar wooden bowl onto the small table between them. Lucas looked at it with quiet curiosity. "That hardly belongs inside a royal palace." Eleanor smiled. Neither did the woman who gave it away. She began telling him everything. She spoke about the cold afternoon in Frost Hollow Park, the hungry stranger sitting alone, the young Omega who had not eaten for 2 days, and the warm bowl of soup offered without hesitation. Then she described the days that followed. The apple shared with a hungry child. The farmer whose cart had been freed from the mud. The silver coins Grace Bennett politely refused. Every story was simple. None involved grand heroics or impossible sacrifices. Yet each revealed the same quiet heart. Lucas listened without saying a single word. The library grew silent except for the soft crackling of burning firewood. When Eleanor finally finished, she carefully rested one hand upon the empty wooden bowl. "I did not search for a future queen among palaces," she said gently. "I searched where compassion survives without applause." Lucas lowered his eyes toward the bowl. He imagined the young woman walking away hungry after giving away the only meal she possessed. For reasons he could not fully explain, that image remained in his thoughts long after the story ended. "What is her name?" he asked quietly. "Grace Bennett." Eleanor watched the subtle change in her son's expression. Curiosity had replaced doubt. "Do not invite her to the palace," Lucas said after another thoughtful silence. "If she learns who I am before we meet, I will never know whether she speaks to me honestly or to my title." Eleanor's gentle smile returned. "I hoped you would say that." Lucas stood and walked toward the tall window overlooking the palace gardens, where golden leaves drifted peacefully across the stone paths below. Somewhere beyond the distant hills, an ordinary young Omega continued searching for work, completely unaware that the Alpha King himself had just decided to enter her world not as a ruler wearing a crown, but as nothing more than another traveler hoping to discover whether his mother's extraordinary stories could truly belong to one remarkable heart. A gentle rain arrived before noon, covering Frost Hollow Pack with a silver mist that softened every rooftop and turned the narrow streets into glistening ribbons of stone. Grace Bennet pulled the hood of her faded blue coat over her hair, as she carried a small basket filled with neatly folded shirts she had spent the previous evening mending for a local tailor. The work had earned only a few dollars, but she treasured every opportunity because it meant another day without giving up hope. She hurried through the marketplace, careful not to let the rain soak the clean clothes, when she noticed a young traveler standing alone beneath the wooden awning of an old bookstore. His dark coat was damp from the weather, and although he appeared calm, he looked unfamiliar to the village. Lucas Ashford had arrived before sunrise wearing plain traveling clothes instead of royal garments, determined to see Grace Bennet with his own eyes before revealing anything about himself. Only 2 members of the Shadow Guard watched discreetly from opposite ends of the street, blending naturally among merchants and passing travelers. Lucas had expected to observe quietly, but fate chose another path. A sudden cry echoed from the opposite side of the square. A little girl stood beside a fruit stand, tears filling her eyes as several bright oranges rolled across the wet street after her small basket slipped from her hands. The rolling fruit drifted toward muddy puddles while busy shoppers hurried past, trying to avoid the rain. Instead of stopping to help, without hesitation, Grace carefully placed the tailor's basket beneath the bookstore awning to keep the clothes dry before kneeling on the rain-covered stones. She chased each orange one by one, wiping away moisture with the edge of her sleeve before gently placing every piece back into the child's basket. When the frightened girl thanked her with a trembling smile, Grace simply tucked a loose strand of hair behind the child's ear and replied softly, "Everyone needs a little help on rainy days." Lucas watched every movement in complete silence. There was nothing dramatic about what she had done. No audience applauded. No reward followed. Yet the quiet sincerity in her voice reached him more deeply than the grand speeches he had heard inside royal halls. As Grace stood to collect the tailor's basket, she noticed the unfamiliar traveler still standing beneath the awning. Rain continued falling beyond the narrow shelter. "You have been waiting here for quite a while," she said with gentle concern. Lucas offered a polite smile. "I was hoping the rain would slow down." Grace looked toward the gray sky before glancing at the sturdy umbrella leaning beside the bookstore entrance. The elderly shopkeeper nodded kindly when she asked permission to borrow it for a few minutes. Returning to the traveler, she held the umbrella toward him. "Please take this until the rain eases. I can return it later." Lucas looked surprised. "Then how will you get home?" Grace laughed quietly. "I have been caught in the rain before. It is only water." Her simple answer carried no trace of sacrifice, only cheerful acceptance. For one brief moment, Lucas felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside him. His wolf, normally calm and disciplined, stirred quietly with unexpected warmth, not from instinct alone but from profound admiration. Grace did not ask his family name, where he came from, or whether he could repay her kindness. She simply saw another person standing alone in the rain. As they walked together beneath the borrowed umbrella toward the edge of the marketplace, speaking casually about the changing weather and the beauty of autumn leaves, Lucas found himself smiling with an ease he had not felt in years. Hidden across the street, the 2 shadow guards exchanged silent glances, recognizing something their alpha king himself had not yet spoken aloud. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with thunder or ceremony. Sometimes it appeared beneath a shared umbrella on an ordinary rainy afternoon, carried quietly by the kindness of a woman who never expected the world to remember her name. The following morning the rain had disappeared, leaving Frost Hollow Pack washed clean beneath a brilliant blue sky. The annual autumn market filled the village square with cheerful music, colorful banners, and the rich scent of fresh bread drifting from every corner. Families wandered between wooden stalls decorated with pumpkins, apples and handmade crafts, while children laughed beneath strings of fluttering ribbons. Grace Bennet arrived carrying a neatly folded bundle of repaired clothing for the tailor who had finally begun trusting her with more work. For the first time in many days, she allowed herself to believe life might slowly be improving. She had almost reached the tailor's shop when a loud voice interrupted the peaceful atmosphere. "Someone has taken my family necklace." A young noblewoman named Victoria Holloway stood outside an elegant jewelry stall, her face pale with alarm. The silver necklace had disappeared only moments earlier, while several customers examined handcrafted ornaments displayed on velvet cloth. Curious whispers spread quickly through the growing crowd. Shopkeepers looked around nervously while visitors searched beneath tables and baskets. Victoria's eyes slowly swept across everyone nearby before stopping on Grace. "You were standing closest to the display," she said firmly. Grace blinked with quiet surprise. "I only walked past on my way to the tailor." Victoria folded her arms. "Then you surely would not object if someone checked what you are carrying." A heavy silence settled over the square. Grace looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some appeared uncertain. Others simply avoided meeting her eyes. No one openly defended her, yet no one seemed eager to accuse her either. The uncertainty itself felt heavier than any harsh words. Grace quietly placed her bundle of clothing upon a nearby table and unfolded every neatly repaired shirt and coat so everyone could see inside. There was nothing except carefully stitched garments waiting to be returned to their owners. Victoria frowned slightly. Perhaps she hid it somewhere else. Grace met her eyes without anger. "I did not take your necklace." Before another word could be spoken, the elderly jeweler suddenly stopped searching beneath the display cabinet. His expression changed from confusion to embarrassment. "Wait." He reached into the inner pocket of his own work apron and slowly removed the missing silver necklace wrapped safely inside a polishing cloth. The entire crowd fell silent. He lowered his head with sincere regret. "Lady Holloway, I prepared it for cleaning before the market became busy. I forgot I had placed it there." A wave of relieved laughter moved through the square. Several people smiled awkwardly, while others quietly returned to their shopping. Victoria's confident posture disappeared. She looked toward Grace with obvious discomfort. I was mistaken." Grace simply smiled with gentle kindness. "I am glad your necklace was never truly lost." She carefully folded the repaired clothing once again, and prepared to continue toward the tailor's shop as though nothing important had happened. Hidden among the crowd wearing the same simple traveler's clothing, Lucas Ashford had witnessed every moment. What remained in his thoughts was not the false accusation itself. It was the remarkable calm with which Grace had accepted being questioned. She had never raised her voice, never answered embarrassment with resentment, and never demanded an apology once the truth became clear. Nearby, one of the disguised shadow guards quietly approached him. "Your Majesty," he whispered almost silently, "shall we reveal your identity now?" Lucas kept his eyes on Grace as she disappeared peacefully into the busy marketplace, helping an elderly woman lift a heavy basket before continuing on her way. A quiet smile touched his face. "Not yet," he answered softly. "Today I learned something my mother's stories could never fully capture. A truly noble heart does not become bitter simply because the world fails to recognize its worth." Grace Bennet had almost disappeared into the crowd when the clear sound of ceremonial horns echoed across Frost Hollow Pack. Conversations stopped in the middle of sentences. Musicians lowered their instruments. Merchants stepped away from their stalls as every eye turned toward the eastern road. A procession of royal riders entered the village beneath banners embroidered with the silver wolf crest of House Ashford. Sunlight reflected from polished armor, while the crowd instinctively stepped aside to create a wide path through the marketplace. Grace did the same, lowering her eyes respectfully before lifting the bundle of repaired clothing back into her arms. She intended to leave quietly before the ceremony blocked the streets. Just as she turned away, a familiar voice called gently behind her. "Miss Bennet, would you stay for a moment?" Grace stopped immediately. Her heart skipped as she recognized the calm voice of the elderly woman she had once met in the park. Slowly she turned around. The woman who had worn a faded gray shawl now stood dressed in an elegant midnight blue royal gown trimmed with silver embroidery. Her silver hair rested neatly upon her shoulders, and the quiet dignity surrounding her made the entire square fall into complete silence. Royal guards bowed deeply as she stepped forward. Shock spread across every face in the marketplace. The flower seller was gone. The lonely traveler was gone. Standing before them was Queen Mother Eleanor Ashford herself. Grace's eyes widened with disbelief. Memories rushed through her mind all at once. The cold afternoon. The warm bowl of soup. the trembling hands, the quiet smile. She instinctively lowered her head. "Your Majesty, I did not know." Eleanor reached forward before Grace could bow any farther and gently took both of her hands into her own. "I know you did not," she answered with unmistakable warmth. Turning toward the gathered townspeople, Eleanor's calm voice carried effortlessly across the silent square. "Several days ago I sat alone in this village, disguised as a stranger. Hundreds of people passed me. Some smiled politely. Many never looked at me at all. They believed I had nothing to offer them. Every person listened without moving. Even the autumn breeze seemed to pause beneath the weight of her words." Eleanor continued softly. "One young Omega stopped beside me. She had not eaten for nearly 2 days. She had only one warm bowl of soup purchased with the last money she possessed." Grace felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Eleanor smiled gently. "She placed that bowl into my hands without asking my name, without asking where I came from, and without expecting anything in return. She simply believed another person was hungry." From within a small embroidered satchel, Eleanor carefully lifted the same simple wooden bowl that had been cleaned and preserved since that afternoon. She held it with both hands as though it were more valuable than any royal treasure. "This bowl reminds me that compassion cannot be measured by what someone gives. It is measured by what they have left after giving." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Victoria Holloway lowered her eyes with visible shame. The elderly jeweler removed his cap respectfully. Grace remained speechless, struggling to understand why someone so important had remembered such an ordinary moment. Then another figure stepped forward from the line of royal riders. The familiar traveler from the rainy afternoon removed his dark cloak, revealing an elegant black royal coat adorned with silver embroidery. Sunlight caught his silver eyes as he smiled gently at Grace. Recognition filled her face almost instantly. The stranger who had shared an umbrella with her was standing before the entire village as Alpha King Lucas Ashford. He walked toward her with calm, unhurried steps and stopped only a few feet away. Looking into her astonished eyes, he spoke with quiet sincerity. "Miss Bennet, my mother searched for a future queen by looking for the rarest treasure in this kingdom. She did not search for wealth or noble blood. She searched for the kind of heart that remains generous, even when no one believes it matters. And she found that heart in you." For several quiet moments, the entire marketplace stood frozen beneath the warm afternoon sunlight. No one spoke. No one moved. Grace Bennet looked from Queen Mother Eleanor Ashford to Alpha King Lucas Ashford, still struggling to believe that the two strangers she had welcomed into her ordinary life were the most respected members of the kingdom. She lowered her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your Majesty, I only did what I hoped someone would have done for me." Lucas smiled gently. "That is exactly why it mattered." His words settled over the crowd with remarkable calm. They were not spoken like a royal proclamation, but like a simple truth that had been waiting to be discovered. Eleanor stepped beside Grace and carefully placed the familiar wooden bowl into her hands. The smooth surface reflected the golden light of late afternoon, and for a moment Grace remembered the cold wind, the empty feeling in her stomach, and the quiet peace she had felt after giving the soup away. She had believed that moment was gone forever. Instead, it had quietly become part of her future. Eleanor looked toward the people gathered throughout the square. "Many believe generosity begins when life becomes comfortable," she said softly. "This young woman taught me the opposite. True generosity begins when comfort has already disappeared." The villagers lowered their heads with thoughtful silence. Victoria Holloway stepped forward first, her expression filled with sincere regret. "Miss Bennet," she said gently, "I judged you before I knew your heart. I hope one day you will forgive me." Grace offered the same warm smile that had comforted strangers throughout the week. "There is nothing to forgive. We all make mistakes when we only see part of someone's story." The elderly jeweler nodded in quiet agreement, while several merchants exchanged embarrassed glances, remembering the many times they had overlooked the humble Omega walking through their streets. Lucas watched every word Grace spoke, and each quiet answer confirmed everything his mother had seen. She carried no pride after receiving praise, no resentment after receiving doubt, and no desire to remind anyone that she had been right. Her kindness remained exactly the same. Lucas slowly removed the silver wolf crest fastened to the collar of his royal coat. Rather than placing it upon Grace, he held it respectfully between both hands. "This crest represents responsibility before privilege," he said. "I will not ask you to accept it today. Instead, I ask something far more important." Grace met his calm silver eyes. "What is that, Your Majesty?" Lucas smiled with quiet sincerity. "Allow me the chance to know you, not as an alpha king searching for a queen, but as a man who wishes to learn from the woman whose kindness has already changed his understanding of what true strength looks like." Grace felt unexpected warmth rise within her heart. She had never dreamed of palaces or crowns. She had only wanted an honest life built upon compassion. After a thoughtful silence, she nodded gently. "I would like that." A peaceful wave of smiles spread throughout the marketplace. Eleanor closed Grace's fingers carefully around the wooden bowl. "Keep this," she whispered. "Whenever life becomes difficult again, remember that one simple choice made with love changed more lives than you could ever imagine." Church bells echoed across Frost Hollow Pack as the sun slowly descended behind distant hills, covering the village with soft amber light. Lucas and Grace began walking side by side through the marketplace, neither leading nor following the other, while Queen Mother Eleanor watched with quiet contentment. The same streets that had once witnessed hunger, uncertainty, and quiet sacrifice now witnessed hope taking its first gentle steps. Above them, golden leaves drifted through the evening breeze, and the kingdom seemed to understand a lesson no royal decree could ever teach. A crown may be inherited, power may be earned, but only a heart that continues to give when it has almost nothing can truly change the destiny of others.